Welcome back to Pentateuch. We're going to look at the factual data sheet for narratives, specifically Genesis, and part 2. In part 1, we looked at macro hermeneutics, or the big picture, or the context outside of the passage. In factual data sheet part 2, we're going to examine the details of the passage itself. We're going to look inside at the content, or micro hermeneutics. We're going to look at what is unique with the genre of narratives. Narratives have different literary characteristics that are different from, say, poetic books in the Old Testament, or prophetic books, or the paragraphs in epistles. In narratives, you have scenes, and those scenes are like paragraphs in the epistles or stanzas in Hebrew poetry. So it's important to identify the scenes, the beginning of a scene, the end of a scene, because often those scenes, when you study them, get a summary statement of all of them that will give you what is the main point of this passage, which will become the main point of your sermon or Bible study. And also, those scenes can become main division. Sometimes, if it's a long narrative, a combination of scenes will become a main division. So being able to identify the scenes is very important. So we identify scenes sometimes grammatically with a key word, such as in Genesis 6:1, and it came to pass. Your English Bible may have something else, but that is a grammatical clue. It's like a therefore in the New Testament epistle paragraphs. It often begins a scene, but sometimes it begins an entire episode. So scenes are identified by grammatical clues. Scenes are identified by quotes or content change. Verse 3, that would be your next scene, which is dialogue. Scenes are identified by content changes. Verse 4. So now he starts talking about something totally different. There were giants in the earth. Scenes are identified by location change. Verse 5. So he broadens out to describe that this wickedness was worldwide. Scenes are identified by content changes. Here you begin to look at the biography of Noah. So you get the point. We have to be able to identify the beginning of a scene and the end of a scene. And when let's say you identify each scene and then put a summary statement beside of it, and again, that can give you the main point of this passage. We're looking at Genesis 6-8. What do we learn there? We learn that God blesses man because of his faith with more detail. Okay, so we went over this when we went over the rubric. And so read this and you can see the more details that are given here. And this is how it fits in with the format of the template or rubric. All right, we not only identify the scenes, but we identify the plot, the storyline, as it is known. So typically, a plot has a beginning, middle, and end. And so that's how we want to develop our sermon and Bible study. We want to start at the beginning, work our way through the middle, and end at the end. We don't want to start in the middle, go to the beginning, and then jump to the end. If we do that, what do? We destroy. We de-story, as someone said. The story, we de-story. The story, we destroy it. So let's begin where Moses began, and let's end where Moses ended. Let's don't tear up the story. So the beginning. Sometimes in the beginning, as here you have that grammatical clue, and it came to pass, and then in the beginning, especially of an episode, not in every scene, but the beginning of a big story or a big narrative, such as the flood, you have the characters, the main characters that are introduced. And so in the middle, you have the crisis. So in verse 2, you have sinful marriages. In verses 2 to 4, and you have worldwide wickedness in verses 5 to 8. And then in the end, you have the solution to the crisis. And that, of course, is the flood and God delivering Moses. So here's a big chiasm. This is related to, there's a chiasm for Genesis 6, 7, and 8. 6, 7, and 8, that's 3 chapters, but you can have a chiasm as big as the whole story of Joseph, chapters 37 to 50, a chiasm. And in the middle of the chiasm is the main point. It's based on the Greek letter chi, chiasm. And so it leads up to the main point. Joseph tests his brothers, and then it flows out of that. But you have the parallels going on, such as at the beginning of this chiasm, Joseph the dreamer, and at the end you have Joseph the provider. And so this is a literary device that Moses used. And you can see how I call the authors of the Bible literary artists. So we want to be able to we want to be able to identify the plot, the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then next comes scene depiction. That is when scenes are intentionally slowed down. The action in a scene is slowed down, or it is sped up. If it's unimportant, it's sped up in years, and maybe hundreds of miles are skipped because it's not important. So it took Joseph's brothers, for example, about 10 days to travel 200 miles by donkey from Canaan to Egypt in Genesis 42:3, only one verse. Why? Well, that's a scene depiction. It speeds up the action. It jumps 10 days and 200 miles because that's not important to the story. It doesn't advance the plot. But when they get to Egypt, the action slowed down because Joseph is going to test his brothers. So watch for what, if something is skipped, then that does not contribute to the advancement of the plot. We want to be able to identify a characterization of characters as heroes or villains or protagonists and antagonists. So the protagonist in the flood is Noah. The antagonist is the ungodly line of Cain and sinful mankind. So you want to see, is the author, he's not stretching the truth. He's not falsely making a hero out of this person, or he's not falsely making a villain out of this person, but he is characterizing them, because that's part of a narrative, is to have a hero and a villain, and he's just telling the truth. He may not tell everything about that person. You have a sinful world in Genesis 6. That doesn't mean everybody was sinful, or that doesn't mean there were no good moral people, but characteristically they were evil. And then dialogue. Dialogue is very, very important in narratives. And it's very compressed. There's no wasted words. We looked at Genesis 6:3, and the Lord said, "My spirit will not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, and his days shall be 120 years. Well, what's happening here? Well, that's the condition of the world that brought on the worldwide flood. So it's almost like the theme, often the theme of the narrative is communicated through the words of the characters or the author, if he is giving like an editorial comment. And then you have the repetition of key words such as land. Land in Genesis is important. Land in Joshua is important because they are going into the promised land. And then you have those grammatically significant words as we brought out, and it came to pass. You have theologically important words such as the Abrahamic covenant, seed, the seed of Abraham. And so now we looked at the context, the very broad context, the remote context in macro hermeneutics. But in micro hermeneutics, we're actually inside the narrative itself looking at what is unique about narratives that can help us find the main point of the passage, which will become the main point of the sermon or Bible study. And how is that main point developed? Through main divisions that we can identify when we identify the scenes.